Good morning, church. It's good to be with you again. In church today, this is Sunday afternoon now. In church today, we finished the 8th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, Father's Day, and so we celebrated Father's Day a little bit, and I talked about what it means to be a man in today's society, a godly man who seeks the way of the Lord. And in our conclusion of our Hope for Tomorrow campaign, that we've been talking about, we quoted again Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. We talked about how challenging that can be in life sometimes because our circumstances are often difficult. And yet we still hear the promise as it echoes in our hearts. And so in the beginning of this sequence of three stories, three sets of questions that Jesus asks, the first story was Jesus tells the disciples to get in the boat. They're going to the other side of the lake, which is this euphemism for going to the other side of the tracks. And they get in the boat, and there's a storm, and they're worried, and they're concerned about the cares of this world. Jesus is asleep, and so Jesus wakes up, and to show that he has authority, not only over nature, but over the troubles of life, he calms the storm. And so he has the authority in our lives over the circumstances of our life. And whenever there is trouble in the midst of our circumstances, the most important thing for us to remember is, where is your faith? It's the question that Jesus asked the disciples. When you're in trouble, just simply ask yourself, where's your faith? God's got this. He's in charge. He's the one who has authority over the wind and the waves and the troubles of life. They get to the other side of the lake, and it's very clear that he goes to a specific place. He has a divine appointment with a man who is possessed by demons. And with authority over the spiritual forces, the realm of good and evil, the forces of angels and demons, Jesus is in control. And so he commands the demons to get out of this man. What's important for us to remember is Jesus has the authority over good and evil, but also that he makes this divine appointment with a man. He goes to a man who there is no way that man would ever come to Jesus. There's no way he would ever come. And so I talked this morning about this phrase that my father used to say, which is, Ernie, we need to have a come to Jesus meeting. And I usually knew that that meant I had said or done something that was inappropriate, and we were going to have a fairly serious conversation about my thoughts and behaviors. And that conversation tended to be stern, tended to be authoritarian, and the voice of command. And that's exactly how Jesus talks to this man who is possessed or owned by the demons of life. And he commands the demon to get out. And the point is, Jesus goes to the man. And then our story for today begins like this, verse 40. Jesus returned. When Jesus returned, in other words, he got back in the boat and went back across the lake, back home. Luke makes it sound as if they went across the lake deliberately to meet this one man, like it was truly a divine appointment, that Jesus made an effort to get to this man who was literally chained by ownership to the things that are not of God. And now he returns home, and a crowd presses in on him. And as the crowd is pressing in on Jesus, a man named Jairus comes. Perfect story for Father's Day. He comes, and his daughter is sick unto death. And he says, Jesus, I need your help. I need you to get involved in my daughter's life and to make a difference. And the stories stand in contrast to one another. In the first story, the man on the shore, Jesus has to go to him because the man would never make an effort to come to Jesus, and that's because he's owned by the circumstances of life. In the second story, Jairus makes an effort to come to Jesus. They both have trouble. Their turmoils and their troubles in life are fairly commanding. This man's daughter is going to die. She's sick unto death. And so he's desperate. He wants Jesus to make a difference. And then in the midst of him going to Jairus' house, the crowd presses in again, and a woman reaches out and touches the hem of Jesus' garment. And again, we have another example of someone who comes to Jesus And Jesus' response, when a person comes willingly to Jesus, his response is, "Who touched me?" It's sort of like, "What's your name?" but not quite. It's, "Who touched me?" And Peter, being Peter, he doesn't understand. And he said, "What do you mean somebody touched you? There's hundreds of people touching you." But Jesus understands that this particular woman came to him different from the way that other people come to him. She came expecting her life to be transformed, and all she needed to do was reach out and touch him. And she does, and she receives power to overcome that trouble in her life. And so this story exists for a couple of reasons. One, to show us that Jesus has authority over spiritual transformation. If we willingly come to Jesus, he willingly gives us the power to be changed. And even though the words may be the same, that he speaks to a man possessed who will not come, and a man who willingly comes, even though the words may be the same, the tone is different. In one, it is the authoritarian voice of command, and in the other, it is the voice of opportunity unto transformation. And then after the conversation with the woman, Jesus goes to Jairus' house, and the little girl is raised from the dead. And it shows us that Jesus has authority over life and death situations. Now, you and I, when we read this story, or I'll speak for myself, when I read this story, there is a temptation, there's an issue that I personally have to come to grips with, and that is, well, does that story mean that if I have faith enough to pray hard enough, that my wife or my daughter are going to be healed? And if that doesn't happen, then do I lack faith? And so this story has the potential of taking me to places that I've been and I don't want to go again, because this is not a story about healing. This is a story about coming to Jesus and meeting Jesus where he is. The story about healing and the resurrection from the dead is simply there to show us that Jesus has authority over these things. And we've all loved someone, and certainly at times in our prayers unto God say, just give me a little more time with my loved one, and they die anyway. Or they stay sick and they don't get better. And if we go down the path of, having enough faith so as to transform this, then it makes us angry when it doesn't work out the way that we think is fair. And that can own us. That's a possession that can own us. That can make us bitter and angry toward God. And so the question that God asks, whether there is life or death, sickness or health in my life, the question is always the first question that he asked the disciples: where's your faith? God is sovereign over these things. People live and die. People get sick and they don't get better. It's just simply the way that life is. And the real question is, can I willingly come to Jesus and accept that he's sovereign over these things, whether or not they work out the way that I do, and the way that I want them to? And so I close with this story about Dr. Faustus, which is a book that I read as a play written by Christopher Marlowe. And it talks about a man who makes a deal with the devil, and he gets all of the successful things that life has to offer. And the devil empowers him to become more than, like a superhero almost, more than life could imagine. And in the end of his life, he's walked down this path of not listening to God for so long that as he walks, the devil comes to collect the pack, and as he walks through the end of his life and journeys toward the gates of hell, he keeps hearing God say, repent, Faustus, and in the end, the gates fling open, and he takes his journey down the steps, and he hears the voice say, it's not yet too late to repent, Faustus, and his response is, it is for me. And so sometimes when we allow ourselves to not answer the trials of life with faith, we get owned. We get possessed by things that we really don't want in our life. We really don't desire them, but we sometimes can't find our way clear. And so Jesus says, listen, if you're at a place in your life and you have an opportunity to have a come to Jesus meeting that is willing, something that you want to do, then he will give you power to become what he wants you to become. That is not a guarantee that your circumstances are going to become what you want them to become, but it is a promise that you will have assurance that whatever the circumstances are, He is sovereign over them. He is God. Just have faith and believe and don't worry about it. And that's easier said than done, and really can't be done without Jesus and the power that Jesus gives unto you. And so I want to encourage you in your life. If you're at a place where you can willingly come to Jesus, you should reach out and touch the hem of His garment, and He will give you the power to overcome the troubles of life. Thank you.